In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Welcome back, everybody, to It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast about economics and capitalism and mental health and other related issues. Harriet is not with us today. She's out of town. So it's just myself talking to myself and also a human being named Catherine Liu, who is going to talk a lot about something called the Professional-Managerial Class, which we will abbreviate probably throughout our talk as the PMC. Some of you are kind of online leftist nerds who completely know what those letters mean, and others may have heard those letters for the first time. And so we're actually going to start with me doing quite a PMC thing and just reading the Wikipedia page about what the PMC is to give a little bit of background. Then I'll segue into saying why we're even talking about this with Catherine, because it may not actually seem like it's a mental health connective therapy related type thing, but as we get into it, we'll see that it very much is. So the professional managerial class, according to Wikipedia, which is, the arbiter of truth, was an influential new class hypothesis in social science in the US in the 1970s by John and Barbara Ehrenreich. The Ehrenreichs hypothesized a social class within capitalism that, by controlling production processes through superior management skills, was neither proletarian nor bourgeoisie. The hypothesis contributed to the Marxist debates on class in Fordism and was used as an analytical category in the explanation of non-proletarian employees. This group of middle-class professionals is distinguished from other social classes by their training and education, typically business qualifications and university degrees, with occupations including academics, teachers, social workers, engineers, managers, nurses, and middle-level administrators. The PMC tends to have incomes above the average for their country. It's estimated that in the 1930s, the United States, people in professional managerial class occupations made up less than 1% of total employment. By 1972, about 24% of American jobs were in the PMC category. By 1983, the number had risen to 28%, and in 2006, 35%. James Burnham proposed the existence of a similar class in his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, and argued they'd become the new ruling class. Okay, so that's what the PMC is. Now, I mentioned this in the last podcast, we got dumped by one patron saying we're not really talking about mental health anymore. We're kind of jumping all over the place. We heard that, we reflected on it, and so I've felt compelled, and Harriet's felt compelled to say, here's what this has to do with mental health. So this isn't necessarily clear in our sort of myopic and I think crappy conceptualization of what mental health is until we get into it. And so here's the connection for me, and we'll have a link to the Jacobin interview that Catherine did a couple of weeks ago for folks to, I highly recommend watching and listening to that. But some of her comments specifically about kind of the modern manifestation of the PMC and its use of, and she'll say this better than I will in a minute, sort of use of like fake empathy and like almost like abuse of emotional intelligence and psychotherapy and mental health concepts and language that function as a reinforcement of class positionality more than what it looks like it's doing. And a couple examples that Catherine and the hosts Jen Pan and Ariella Thornhill were using was talking about managers within firms who use this kind of language, like empathy, be a good listener and validate the emotions of your employees, but then within the same breath, fighting tooth and nail against workers who are trying to form unions and to organize for better workplace conditions within the workplace. So you can kind of see how there is a very distinct kind of class divide between those who are in a lower position, whether it is blue collar or maybe even more like professionals within firms that aren't within a managerial strata, but how people within the higher class strata, and they're not at like the very, very tippy top 0.001% of like owning the means of production, so to speak, but they will kind of within one breath say that I validate your emotions. I can see that you're suffering from trauma talk, therapy talk, and then fight against your class interests, fight against you being able to secure better quality of life for yourself. So that's where the mental health connection comes in. Hopefully that's clear for anyone who thinks this is a crazy, weird, outlandish thing to be talking about on the podcast. So without further ado, Catherine, how's it going?
Good. I love that introduction, Max. Thank you so much. One of the things that we wanted to talk about today, which is very Freudian and psychoanalytic, is about how the PMC monopolizes the voice of the superego in post-industrial capitalism. And it tells you what you should be. It offers an ideal of, empathetic communication that is actually a form of domination and punishment. And one of the things I've talked about in the past with friends, and I haven't actually put this into writing, is that I really feel like Trump's success had to do with a rebellion of the id against the superego. And he represents that like anguished cry, impulse control lacking baby. And the PMC try to be the adults in the room. But as Freud taught us, the superego is very sadistic. And the sadism of the PMC comes in its denial of economic inequality and its monopolization of psychic well-being, the language of psychic well-being. And I think that that's what's really disturbing to me about this. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about trauma and Max was more hesitant about it was that I wanted to talk about its use right now under COVID in the workplace. And just recently this week, my bosses or proxy chairs of my department came in and talked about how they had learned so much about trauma and trauma relationality in a meeting of the chairs, and they were really into this language, and we've all been traumatized. And I felt like saying, but I didn't, because there's no room for this now, and everyone's terrified of dissenting on the language about the language of trauma and its management at work, is that the last place I want to manage my trauma is at work. And I don't know that that position is actually allowed anymore, because these days when we do Zoom check-ins, people talk about very willingly, like give up information about their private lives to create more relationality on the Zoom grid. But I don't want to do that. And I know other people don't want to do that. But once someone starts to do that, you feel hailed to participate in this kind of therapeutic mode of relating. And I would say pseudo-therapeutic mode. And as someone who's been through a lot of psychoanalysis and psychological and therapy, I would say that the insights that I received or that I was able to come to in the analytic setting, in the clinical setting, are really precious to me, and they come from a position of trust that I have with the therapist or the analyst, and it comes out of an understanding of how my unconscious interacted with certain traumatic events to create a fantasy of who I was. And it actually reinforced my narcissism. And that's like the really disturbing or traumatic insight that you get in psychic healing. And you're not going to get that in a kind of like, hey, what's up, guys? Oh, I had this happen to me. Yeah, this is really bad. Yeah, we're going to, have a wellness walk, virtual wellness walk with all of you colleagues soon, blah, blah, blah. Like that to me is so superficial and so degrading with regard to human experience. And I feel like there is going to be a huge backlash against this sort of liberal managerial superegoic imperative to make the workplace therapeutic, pseudo-therapeutic. I would say it's fake therapy. And it was building up to this before COVID, when wellness, which also Barbara Ehrenreich writes about too, which I worked on with a group of graduate students and colleagues. The talk of wellness is about the fully commodified notion of mental health. It's like you have to spend money to get well. You have to spend money to get well and to indulge in wellness. And this explosion of wellness discourse happens as our national healthcare system is collapsing. Well, we don't have one. We don't have a national healthcare system. Our healthcare system is collapsing. It's fragmented. It's unaffordable. But especially for graduate students, the university is extremely stressful. There are no jobs. This was before COVID, right? And they had all of these wellness initiatives for graduate students to allay their stress, to help them do this. I found it very pandery, condescending, fake. And there were new administrative positions that were open that were dealing with student wellness. And it's been proven in study after study that the largest improvement in mental health that's achievable through policy and through organizational action is actually paying people more. So rather than paying people more, because graduate students live on very little, and
Right.
where UCI is a very expensive place to live, rather than paying people more, because that would actually cost your employer a lot of money, they start these wellness initiatives that make administration feel good. That is good for administration. So I think the professional managerial class attitude towards healthcare, towards mental health as an object to be managed is one of the biggest problems of our times. So I think the
So,
connection is really natural.
right. So let's rewind. There's like a cluster of so many goodies there. One is your psychoanalytic framing of this, and maybe just for listeners who don't know, because our sort of primary hopefully intended or targeted audience is mental health professionals to help kind of wake them up. We don't really know how well we've done with that. But for those that aren't mental health professionals or aren't familiar with psychoanalytic stuff, there's these sort of three things in Freudian theory. There's sort of superego, ego, and id. And the superego is this very like moralistic, your ability to think morally and do the right thing, which is the id is quote unquote the lowest. Maybe it's like this super impulsive, like when you eat the nasty candy you shouldn't be eating or whatever, and you're like, well, it tastes really good.
It is a cluster of infantile impulses that are mapped out over
Mhm.
the anus, the genital area, and the mouth. And children and
Oh yeah,
infants actually don't have a differentiated genital area, so it's actually
Mhm.
oral and anal.
Right, man. You're you know psychoanalysis more than I do. It's actually a pretty involved thing. I wasn't trained super well in psychoanalytic, but yeah, it's impulsivity, and then ego is sort of when people say like, oh, it's all about your ego. It's actually more conceptualized as just, I guess, what your quote unquote core self would be, but it's being sort of like pulled between id and superego. So I find that concept. You did mention this in the Jacobin interview too, of like the Trump supporter camp was like full id, and the sort of maybe DNC, Hillary Clintonite, neoliberal Democrat world was PMC,
Mhm.
and so there was a sort of battle of those two sides going on. I just find that super fascinating. I just wanted to mention that. And
The ego,
uh-huh,
I should mention, is
mhm,
unstable, right? But the
right,
ego is what regulates the relationship between id and superego and presents a presentable, civilized, cultured face to intersubjectivity.
yeah,
So to achieve egoic stability is actually a good thing. So when we say like, oh, it's all about your ego and we want to punish each other for saying that, that's actually not the greatest insult, because actually to have a healthy ego means you've actually self-regulated this sadistic relationship between superego and id, who are connected on this like BDSM circuit. And so to have the ego be a stabilizing force is an achievement. It's a psychological achievement.
So, yeah, thank you for that. So, with this, so also kind of rewinding back, because there was that analysis, which I think is beautiful and really important. This to like fill in some gaps for listeners on this idea of wellness, and because like how do I frame this? Like, here's the question that comes up for me: is it that there's a PMC that's sort of up above in the class strata, and there's maybe those below, maybe bluer collar ish people? Is it that like blue collar type workers, non-PMC workers, don't do the wellness stuff. They don't do the Zoom. Like, what makes it
No,
distinct
no,
about
no,
the
no, no.
PMC, right?
No, 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 no.
Okay.
Right now it's the studies that Jennifer Silva has done about working class psychological life. Jennifer Silva, amazing sociologist who's written
Mhm.
about the Rust Belt in a really, really fantastic way.
Mhm.
I can give Max the reference if any of you are interested in it.
Okay.
Is that the working class right now is one of the biggest consumers of self-help.
Mm.
So in the wake of like not having cohesive communities any longer, and seeing like their lives and their life worlds destroyed by post-industrial, offshoring of jobs, by the dumping of opioids in their communities,
Mhm.
one of the things that they've had to resort to is not clinical psychology or social work, because they're very distrustful of these people because they are PMC types, but they'll
Mhm.
consume self-help books, self-help manuals, self-help language as it occurs on daytime TV and stuff like that. So it's not so fixed and rigid. It's like the PMC has actually leveraged the collapse in American mental health as, a news site for its own like profitability by selling advice industry stuff to people who are in distress.
Yeah.
The other thing about this is that maybe like the working class and the working poor who are just completely indifferent to government and completely indifferent to elections, we feel like, how can we reach them? The PMC is very concerned about apathy.
Mm.
In Silva's interviews with working class people in rural Pennsylvania, one of the things they repeat over and over again is, I'm not voting. It makes no difference to me. Nobody cares about me. And in
Mhm.
fact, that's actually a correct assessment of reality.
Mhm.
So this goes back to your idea that I would say like blue collar or working class, non-college educated people are skeptical about, this kind of managerial class notions of mental health or well-being, but they're also quite desperate especially in these communities where they've seen the families and the churches collapse, and unions and workplaces collapse. So there's like a consumption of certain kind of self-help stuff that I feel like is produced in the edit in the advertising publishing world and then sold to blue collar workers and or non-college educated people.
Mhm.
The other thing about the superegoic voice is that every PMC person has an id, and we're regulating that id all the time. Like this is a universal thing. And so maybe we're more accepting of that superegoic injunction, and like non-college educated or, angry, really angry id type people are rejecting by acting out the superegoic scolds, like you've got to use these pronouns, you've got to be non-sexist, anti-racist at all times,
Mm.
and this kind of like word policing stuff, this without any kind of real program for economic redistribution, this has produced a reaction, I would say across the classes, but maybe among poor people and working class people, it just makes them suspicious of any kind of expertise, of any kind of of any kind of education. And that is also really dangerous for a democracy, because its extreme position is that it makes them reject science and reject
Mm.
scientific truth. And many people are like, okay, well, those capital invaders, like they were not poor people, they were not working class people. But I would say they represent the tip of a kind of populist rejection, which we've seen now for like 20, 30 years of any kind of scientific consensus, whether it be about the vaccine, or about COVID, or about global warming.
Mm.
So they prefer to have like this anguished, person who's yelling all the time and really upset, like right wing radio,
Mm.
shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh. They speak more to their psychic affective state than the PMC like expert who comes in and goes like, well, this is how it is, and that's how it is, and you don't know, and I would tell you. And instead, they rush to listen to these like people who just yell about conspiracy theories and are just in anguish, actually.
Well, I piggybacking on that, because my next question for you was about the superiority complex of the PMC, and this as a sort of cognitive dissonance to sort of relieve this tension of, instead of saying, well, our sort of class and capitalistic economic structure and my position in it explains a lot of the good things in my life or the circumstances within the world. Instead, it moves to this individualistic conceptualization. So I was going to say, well, Rachel Maddow kind of serves that kind of those MSNBC types, because they yell and stuff, right? But they're not vitriolic. They're not saying mean-spirited things. They're saying morally pompous things. They're saying, we are, whoever you are that I'm connecting to, my target audience, which is primarily PMC, liberal, whatever, university educated, a nonprofit, managerial worker, staff, whatever people. We are yelling at Rush Limbaugh. We're yelling at the Republicans and stuff like that. And meanwhile, the people, whoever is mopping the floors of MSNBC and stuff like that, they probably, they don't really give a shit about them. And that's
right.
my professional opinion. Board of behavior.
Thank you for clarifying that, because Rachel Maddow does yell a lot, but it's more like the yelling,
but it's different.
Like the teacher's pet. It's like the yelling of the know-it-all. I can't believe people are so stupid. This is what I know. And isn't it obvious? I think a lot of her tone is isn't it obvious? You have to be an idiot to believe that. What I don't believe. And there's a kind of moral outrage and sanctimony and condescension. I can't even listen to her. I can't listen to the shock jocks either, but
it's all so proxy.
Both positions are really unbearable.
But I think there's a distinct thing there where I think Rachel Maddow, to kind of follow your interpretation here, because I think I share it. Rachel Maddow would be talking about Rush Limbaugh as somebody who is sort of this scumbag, dirtbag, cruel, mean-spirited, and also stupid and uneducated, kind of deplorable type person. And she would use maybe coded language and affect to say that, but she would be sort of puffing out her chest and saying I am better than him. We are better than him. That's the same sort of affect and everything that Hillary Clinton used to talk about Trump and all of Trump's supporters. Right. Whereas when Rush Limbaugh, and this is the thing where it's I guess, to sort of validate, everyone says, well, Rush Limbaugh is a racist and Trump, okay, sure. So there's all that's there. But the thing is, I think they're just pretty honest about it. They're not saying we're morally superior to anyone necessarily. I think they kind of do that too, but they're doing it in a way that is more it is a really good way to say it. It's just we're just so pissed and we're just so disgusted with people and disgusted with everything. And they're just kind of relentless about and really honest about that. And then everyone who feels connected to the genuineness of the vitriol says, let's be part of the same club, because this is how we all feel together. And you know what? Those people think they're morally superior to us, and fuck them.
We're just angry, and we're angry about that. We're angry about being disposable people. We're angry about being treated this way. And the affect is almost like constant anger and outrage. And that's why I think Trump's affect is either anger or self-satisfaction. And he's that's like a baby. It's either fury at the world for slighting him, or just this kind of really infantile narcissism about how awesome he is. And there's no in-between there. And so the in-between, which should be reason or some kind of regulating force, I think scientific deduction, which might be part of the ego, doesn't actually exist in Trump. He's either superego or id. And I feel within the clinical world, at least as I knew it, I don't know about managed care now, because there's so many cognitive behavioral therapy things that, really treat people like algorithms.
Yeah.
And make you fill out what is your satisfaction? What is your depression rate from a scale
of 1 to 10?
Are you very depressed, a little bit depressed, slightly depressed, fine? It's horrible what's happened there. But in my old school psychoanalytic way, it's more therapists and analysts are trying to help you stabilize your ego so that you can have a little bit of reason to deal with both the voices of the and the voices of the superego. And for me, in the new behavioral psychological world, the ego doesn't exist either. It's all the algorithm. It's all the numbers. And we're in a really sad state. I don't think that I think you're right to say the PMC is actually the site of like amazing cognitive dissonance about their own superiority, moral superiority, which actually cloaks their economic superiority and dominance. They
Right.
are constantly, though, having to mediate between like working class rage and then their dependency on capitalists, for instance, because in the world of the liberal professions that John and Barbara Ehrenreich talked about as being the center of the PMC, which has to do with the university, the media, the creative industry, advertising, NGO world. These worlds actually rely on very, very wealthy, invisible donors like foundation
Hmm.
people. And so the PMC really is dependent on the old school, like robber baron capitalists
Right.
for its existence and for its sustenance. It does collect a salary. It can't live on interest alone. These were, Marxist terms like
Hmm.
bourgeoisie owns the means of production, doesn't have to work, labor, lives on capital. The PMC is this intermediate class, and it's not quite wealthy enough to live on capital. It has to go to work every day. It makes a lot of money, but it wants to make more money. And the more it pleases the class above it and trashes the classes below it, the more it's rewarded.
So I'm going to use the term dissociation to also prove that I'm a mental health professional as well, to say I think there's a dissociative element within the PMC as well, because and I think the discourse on, say, white privilege, like, it kind of fits to say, white people kind of, maybe dissociate isn't the right term for that discourse, but white people tend to not see ourselves as a race. And so that's kind of where everybody within the kind of social justice world says, aha, well, so because you don't see yourself as a race, and then there's just like all that conversation. But I think the one really missing piece, I think it's almost more interesting because it's not being talked about, is you can apply the same thing to the PMC and say the PMC doesn't know that it's the PMC. It thinks it's just a person. It thinks it's just people or whatever, right? You can use the same kind of discourse around that and
Right.
say, because of the fact that it's sort of dissociated away from its own class consciousness, and it can't see its position within the hierarchy of economics, it's able to, I don't want to say get away with it, but I guess it's able to kind of keep up the charade. And you used
Well,
the term most delusional class, I think, in the Jacobin, or maybe it was your other
mhm.
podcast.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like, what do you? I mean, because I see that too, that it's almost a delusion to just think we just worked hard to get here and we're just people, and so we just happen to sort of have it better off than like 80% or 70% of people or whatever.
Well, okay, so I'm going to be a little didactic and professorial here, but I'm going to say that this is a class that produces the ideology that supports the status quo.
Well,
And it is the site of ideological production, as John and Barbara Ehrenreich put it in 1997, of the reproduction of class relations, which means it's the reproduction of capitalist ideology. And reproduction is really important here because this class doesn't make anything. I don't make anything. I produce
right.
content for my students, stuff like that.
Hmm.
In that sense, I'm really a member. I'm a member of this class, right?
Right.
I don't know how to
Yeah.
make a car. I don't know how to chop a tree down and make firewood out of it. And so its activities are purely symbolic and manipulative. And it has to be what you talk about in terms of its dissociativeness is it has to maintain that dissociated relationship to reality. So let's say the working class person that Jennifer Silva interviewed said, I'm not going to vote because they don't care about us. Neither party cares about us. I don't, nothing's going to change, right?
Hmm.
That's actually a very realistic assessment
Yeah.
of the elections of 2016 because that was she did the interviews before 2016. If you talk to like masters of the universe, like um, capitalist hedge fund owners and things like that, they'll say, like, the market is freedom, and if you are poor, you're a loser, and that's what the market is just, and the market judges people and it knows our value, and so I'm rich and I'm smarter than all of you. That's also from his, mostly their point of view, like a realistic, very cruel assessment of inequality, but that's what they believe. It's like, you're poor, you deserve to be poor. I'm rich, I deserve to be rich. Government intervenes, they're making things, very fucked up for everyone. So, like, stand back, government. Just let the government let things play out. You'll always have poor people. Big deal. That's very realistic. That's also very realistic. And then you have this PMC intermediate class that just like tries to explain away inequality through meritocracy or intelligence, and it wants to make you believe that the Democrats really care about you, because the Democrats are the party of the PMC.
Well,
And these like working class people in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, I would say, they're like, you know what, screw that. You guys don't care about us. You guys are in bed with oil and gas. You guys want to frack away our homelands. You were the ones who exported all our jobs to China, and now you're like, coming here to help us and empower us with empowerment zones. Like, fuck you guys. I'm not going to vote.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
so when I say the most delusional class, I feel like the two poles, like the working class and the capitalist, actually have more realistic views of what capitalism is. And the
right.
PMC is like, oh, we can have a nicer world. Like, just recycle. And they're producing this ideology of virtue and sanctimony that actually maintains inequality in a much more I don't even like imagine and in a sort of acceptable to them way.
Right. Well, it also sort of, from the convenience of not seeing yourself as a class and then not seeing class, and like you said, so if we would almost just think of three tiers, right? We have sort of like the top, the bourgeoisie up top. We got the blue collar, whatever, poor, working poor, down there, and then in the middle, you just have people that are sort of in this like la la land. Like, we're just people that we do good, like me as a therapist, and any therapist listening right now, or social worker or healthcare worker, of just thinking, well, I'm just one of the good people that does the good stuff for people, right? And also not recognizing that, like, I'm just going to look around my room right now and I'm going to say, there's a door, there's a light bulb in it, there's a dresser, there's a plant in a big plastic thing where there's a bunch of stuff called soil that I don't know where the fuck soil comes from. But then we have windows, I have this blanket and a bed, and there's a carpet, and all the labor that went into that for me to have any sort of quality of life in my bedroom, in my apartment.
Right.
There was gritty sort of, and this is another way that you've explained the distinction, is people who work with their bodies versus their minds. Another, I think, a nice anecdotal way you said it as well, is like, if you live in a warm area or a hot area, PMC are the people with the jobs with air conditioning, and the people who don't are not PMC. But for those of us in the PMC to just sort of, I think, again, dissociate away from, and I guess in Marxist terms, this is what alienation is. This is sort of what he was predicting would happen, or would exacerbate over time.
Well, it happened on the factory floor. It's what he observed.
Okay. Well, I think just as the sort of monster has grown, or the tumor has expanded, I think it's that somebody like me, I'm on this computer. I have all this plastic and metal shit that I don't understand at all.
Right.
That people made or machines made that took away people's jobs. And there's all this stuff in my room, and there's this toilet in my bathroom, and there's water that comes out of it that I don't know anything about how it works. I'm so alienated from every single process, from the extraction, the who had the power and the military or the guns or the laws to force people to, whether it was in like whatever third world country or near the equator, where people were forced to like mine metals and whatever, pull fossil fuels out of the earth. I'm so disconnected from that as a person, from what I do in my daily life, that I can just assume I'm just one of the good people because I'm a therapist, or I'm a nurse, or I'm a doctor, I'm a professor. I educate people, I heal people, or whatever. And I can just almost pretend like this shit just comes out of thin air. Like, I press a button on Amazon or something, and then like my thing shows up, and there's no such thing as a worker. There's no such thing as a working class. I'm just one of the good people. And I think that's sort of, that's another layer of the psychology where
that's ideology at work. That's the ideology of post-industrial capitalism at work. Everything just happens magically.
Yeah.
Nobody's a worker. Everyone's an entrepreneur of their own capacities. And yet, as you say, from the toilet to in your bathroom that's connected to the water sewage system through pipelines that had to be dug by someone, we are connected to this infrastructure of modern life, but we disavow any real participation or cost that modern life exacts on the world. And that is a level of like taking our reality for granted in such an extreme and powerful way. And what you described, actually, sort of looking at the everydayness of these things and these products, and not thinking about the labor that went into them. I think that is a perfect example of the ideological veil that's thrown between us and the processes of production and um, our own status as workers. That
Right.
in terms, we are all employees. We're being paid by someone, and we have to conform, and we have to often eat shit to keep our jobs. But we are so well adapted to the managerial regime that we try to hide our own alienation. So what I wanted to say was, though, that since the publication of this book, I have had so many direct messages, emails on all different media from people from all over the world saying, I've been so angry about what I've been doing. I'm this working class kid and I'm in academia and I'm so angry about this. And I'm finally understanding your book, really helped me. Or you can't believe how people treat. I'm trying to be a union organizer here, and yet we're told by, everyone in the liberal establishment that they're supporting us, but then they're, blocking our progress by, dividing us and making certain minority members of the union, more powerful than others. And we're just trying to get the rank and file organized. It's really, really, set off it's really resonated, like from all the professions I've gotten these reactions, but
Yeah.
everyone is scared to actually go public and talk about these things with each other. And that's the coercive aspect of the PMC and the coercive aspect of work that Marx talked about. Because that person who, mined the metal in the third world that you were talking about before, he or she is not a slave anymore, because under, liberal capitalism, we've abolished slavery. But he or she has to go into extremely dangerous conditions to do that work, because that's the only way he or she can live, can survive, can provide for his or her family. And Marx talks about this. He talks about the working day and the coercion of the factory worker with regard to the processes of production. And he says, this is what capitalism does, is it takes away the best hours of your life, and and you give it to the machine, you give it to capital. And he's talking about the cotton mills of northern England and the coal mines of northern England, because this is where capitalism, when he was writing, was the most developed, and where its damage was the most extreme. And today, we have all of this human resource talk for white collar workers to allay our feelings of alienation, and to make it, seem as if we're just following our passion if we're in specialized professions when doing our work. And I've actually heard from doctors and young residents that they're just horrible things that are happening to them on the work line in COVID, but they're terrified of saying anything because they want to keep their jobs. Because the idea of not having a job in the United States now means not only, being kicked out of your house, it means losing your health care under COVID. It means not being able to put food on the table. So we're all coerced under capitalism to alienate ourselves from um, from our surroundings, the way that you describe, but also from our workplaces, which seem like very pleasant right now because you and I are, at computers and we can work at home without being
Right.
fear of infection. But it's exacting a psychic price on all of us to submit to the lies that management and human resources are like funneling into our heads about, first of all, our worth, our superiority, this bullshit wellness thing, and about the just insane inequality that makes everyone who has a job terrified of losing their job. We are terrorized by this threat. And that's the other thing about the superego, is that the superego uses threat and punishment to keep you in line. And we've been kept in line.
And I think that everything we just kind of covered explains to me a bit more why. So even I forgot what we said in the email, the 99% versus the 1% thing, where you were saying, well, that's just it's almost like a cartoony idea. That's not actually what the percent is because of the PMC. Like the PMC
Yeah.
actually extremely complicates that concept. But
Yeah.
the idea of the 99% would be class unity and class solidarity if you could
Right.
just get everybody within the strata to do the whole "we're going to seize the means of productions" idea somehow, whatever that's,
Right.
there's the how question, that's, but I think the delusionality that you're describing is what prevents the class unity and class struggle, and everything you just described regarding labor organizers or aspiring labor organizers within their workplaces, seeing how the ideology is impeding, which is what I found for a number of years at the just to bring it full circle, at the community mental health clinic I worked at for 5 years. I mean, also being sort of like this arrogant white dude with, like, I don't know, if it was like a bilingual Latina woman with more respect than me, she probably would have made more progress than I would have. But I kept running into this thing of like, well, why don't we just tell so-and-so manager that we have the issue? Why don't we just, what about HR? And I was sitting there stewing in my lefty stuff, just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, we don't, do you not know what the history, do you not know how this works, kind of thing? And it was like, okay, and it almost felt like it dawned on me that I was in this environment now, because I grew up on, like, Section 8 with a single mom and yada yada, and like, so I grew up kind of, not absolute relative poverty for United States standards, and so me kind of climbing the class ladder a little bit, getting into this place and realizing, like, damn, I never realized this, but I'm actually now entering into a world where I don't think it's clear to people that there kind of are two sides here, that there's like people trying to get more out of us for less, and that if you get power in numbers, you do better. And so it's better for us to actually work together on that. That it wasn't, and it's not like blue collar workers get it more or something. I just think it's a little bit more obvious for more blue collar workers that it makes sense, and there's no like bullshit involved in the situation.
Yeah.
But there's the bullshit that's present, I think, within the PMC that makes it. But this is maybe jumping. I was going to ask this as like an ending kind of question, kind of like the podcast you had, the other podcast.
Bungacast. Yeah.
Yes, it's great. I'll link that too if folks want to listen to it. It was a great interview. But the question of like, well, what can be done? And you were talking about sort of PMC union drives, maybe like maybe there's some hope in that, right? That if there is some class consciousness, if it's maybe not perfect, but like at least in hospitals, right? Healthcare unions.
Well, the National Nurses Union has come out for Medicare for all, for universal health care. And I think that in the United States, we have to look at what's feasible, what's doable, and what's achievable for socialism. And let's socialize healthcare first, so that employers don't have the withdrawal of healthcare to threaten their workers with. And that's like a first step. It's a modest first step. I know it's not a solution. I mean, in the UK, they have national healthcare services. They have the NHS, and it's certainly like not the perfect solution for creating a more equitable society. But right now, I feel like ordinary Americans are terrified of alienating their peers, making their bosses mad, offering real critique of their workplace situations, because they are terrified of losing their health care. And the capitalists, this serves health insurance, this serves big pharma, this serves your boss, this serves capitalism to have a scared workplace. And that's why I feel like in the United States, the Bungacast guys are, all over the world. They're in the UK. They're probably in places where there's more socialized medicine. So, they don't see that as like the small achievable goal. But right now, I feel like we just have to look at small achievable goals. There's another small achievable goal, which is universal childcare, which is now all of these things are more on the table. And I feel like, one of my things about DSA, and it's just, I'm a little bit disillusioned with it, is that it gets off on its own subcultural weirdnesses, and it loses touch with the achievable goals that the left can work towards that will benefit all people. It's really important to have universalism be the core of what we're looking at here. And here's the other thing about like people trashing Freud is that, oh, he's so Eurocentric, oh, that's all, that's completely over, he's dead white man, whatever. But I have not come to any conclusions otherwise that contradicts him that the unconscious is a universal component of human experience. And we have to look at, in like happier days, like I thought maybe I would work towards like something called the right to the unconscious, like human right to the unconscious. It seemed like, working class people had no right to an unconscious. And psychoanalysis was only for upper middle class, PMC people or above. And that, the unconscious is such an incredibly rich, scary place that each of us has within our psychic apparatus. And it's a source of creativity. It's a source of great anguish. It's where trauma goes when it's repressed. And I feel like now, though, like everyone is fucked over by behavioral therapy, except for like the very rich people who live in Chicago, New York, or LA who can go to psychoanalysts. Everyone gets like 10 sessions and you're told to like look at a pencil and forget about your trauma. I mean, it's unbelievable how mechanized psychology has become and therapy has become. And I feel like that has really been stripped away from us, all of us, is like the possibility of psychic health and reaching an actual, and this is a very Marxist humanist thing to say, but an actual individual path towards our understanding our relationship individually to fantasy and to reality. Now, that to say that only this kind of relationship that can be healing can happen on an individual level is not to say like, oh, individualism, it's great. No, I think every individual has their own path to the unconscious, but we all universally have to contend with this powerful thing called the unconscious. And like, I know like in psychology classes now, and like Psych 101 that everyone takes, the first thing they tell you is like Freud is bullshit. And in humanities too, like they're, just like, oh yeah, that's like dead white man. And I think like that is just it's an anti-intellectual, anti-historical, anti-theoretical, and just like anti-empirical approach to psyche. And I'm really, really sad about this. Like when when people I know are in distress and they're looking for psychological help, I really don't know what to say anymore. I mean, I don't have any networks of good psychoanalysts because there are very few and they charge a shit ton of money. But I really feel like you call it psychodynamism in in psychological world. It's like still the most important path to healing. And it's been completely leveraged out because managed care says it's not efficient.
And man, there's two like major pieces. I was going to ask you the PMC ally question, but maybe we'll do that in a minute. So based on that, so I was kind of trained primarily. So I'm sort of I'm a child of that generation of psycho therapy training, and that I went through a program. So I went to Antioch, Santa Barbara, and Antioch is known to be a quote unquote social justice type of kind of college, I guess, the colleges that we have. There was some kind of social justice talk in some classes, sort of. I mean, more in the sort of liberal, way. But in the way that we're trained, so there's like Psycho 101, but then there's when you go to sort of therapist school, depends on what therapist school you go to. Like if I would have gone to Pacifica, which is also in my kind of zip code, that is Jungian, that is psychoanalytic or whatever, but it's Jung, right? It's not Freud. And they call it depth psychology. But going to Antioch, they sort of first give you this big, there's like the 12 orientations they call now, and I can't even remember them all, but it's like, Freudian or psychodynamic, there's client-centered, existential, humanistic, or maybe humanistic and client-centered are the same. There are the cognitive behavioral ones. There's a kind of a couple of the cognitive behavioral ones. There's like postmodern and like narrative therapy. There's all these. So there's just been this like smorgasbord of I'm not even saying the term right, of orientations. but when you find like, oh, I kind of like this one, I kind of like that one, maybe you could be quote unquote eclectic and you could mix and match them or whatever. And that seems kind of cool because you're like, well, that one seems helpful. And maybe if I just took a little bit of mindfulness from DBT, then I could like throw that into the psychoanalysis. and then we could do a little bit of existential, like think about death. And that all seems pretty helpful. I mean, I actually do that. Sometimes I'll be like, I'm just going to talk about death with this person for an hour. And then they're like lit up and their relationships improve or whatever. But the problem is once you go into the machine of managed care, you go into a community mental health clinic or a county program or something, you're now in behavioral orientation mode, and that's almost all you can do. You write your documentation for the reimbursement entities, whether they're state or private, and they are written in what we call DIRT format. I'm kind of getting technical, but just so people kind of understand. It's description, intervention, response, treatment. That's what DIRT stands for. So you describe what the client came in, I don't know, looking disheveled and like hysteric, or not, I mean, not judgmental terms, but like client presented problems of XYZ. Your intervention, you write things like this in third person. You write, therapist interviewed client about distress over the last week. Therapist scaled emotions on a 1 to 10 scale. Therapist did this, and then response, you're supposed to write something like, client responded to intervention XYZ, client responded to intervention XYZ, and then treatment mode of DIRT, the T, you're supposed to write, in the following week, therapist will, review homework assigned to client to correct behavior, cognitive thoughts. That's what they tell you. I mean,
you get homework. You get homework. You go to therapy and you get homework. What is that?
Right. Think of the managerial. Well, and I do. So but the other thing is, I was trying to train. The most help I got in my training program was actually in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and I still feel very attached to it. And so Marsha Linehan, she in the 80s.
What is that?
So dialectical behavioral therapy was the only reason that Marsha Linehan, who made this up, and she was like super. This came out in like a New York Times article that somebody interviewed her, and they're like, wow, you like invented this whole thing that like helps borderline people not kill themselves or whatever. And the interview, she finally disclosed like, well, I used to be like horrifically suicidal, and like described the kinds of suicide attempts. I mean, in gruesome detail. This is the kind of stuff that I used to do to myself, and then I'd end up in the hospital. I'd reattempt in the hospital, and then but here's the really interesting thing. And I remember when I told a teen I was working with this, she was just like, well, why the fuck are we doing DBT? I said, Marsha Linehan's life changed when she was sitting in front of a church or something, and she had this like out of body experience, and she was like, I'm healed and I need to help people just like me now. And then she was like, I'm gonna get a PhD in psychology and invent DBT. And she didn't, but here's the thing. So my client was just like, well, why don't I just go to church? And I was like, well, yeah, good question, right? But the thing is, Marsha Linehan, in my opinion, I think she was an extremely subversive person. So she, in the 80s, when she kind of was doing her PhD thing, and I think she was looking at how psychology worked at that time, and she was saying, okay, and she was kind of a devout Catholic, and also became like a sort of Zen Roshi person, and found that the Zen Buddhism stuff was like enormously helpful. And we can, you can critique, I think, all that in PMC world, of course. But she said, okay, I am seeing how the managed care and psychology world won't let us use that. I can't say, well, let's just meditate, or let's just like sweep the floor over and over again for no reason to learn radical acceptance. She created a managed care behavioral modality using bits, trying to kind of turn mindfulness from the Eastern view and the contemplative, even Western view, into like mindfulness to help people be able to actually know like what's going on with them in the moment. I guess in Freudian terms, you could say like shining the light on which parts of the id, ego, or super ego are actually sort of activated and crap.
Okay, I'm going to
disagree.
You finish, and then I'll.
Okay, no, I'm getting into like lecture mode. I think it's helpful. She created a behavioral modality that is very skills based, and I thought was subversively trying to almost aikido the managed system into being helpful for people who are like chronically suicidal, self-harming, and etc. And she also had this orientation around and using a behavioral perspective around this, which I think is fascinating, telling people that because of what we know from behavioral science, we know that hospitalization actually isn't an effective way for you to deal with your suicidality. We want to actually have you like not even be messing with hospitals, because hospitals actually reward, it functions as a reinforcer of your sort of helplessness and inability to solve the emotional dysregulation problem. So I want you to call me. I don't care if it's 1 a.m. I might not be awake, but she invented a thing called, not invented, but phone coaching, and these elements of connectivity to say, when you're about to like do some crazy suicidal shit, I want you to reach out to me, because we're going to make it so you don't go to the hospital. And if you do go to the hospital, I'm not going to talk to you for 24 to 48 hours, because I don't want to reinforce that you try to sort of reward yourself with suicide, because we've already agreed collaboratively that you don't want to kill yourself. And so we're going to do our best to have you not kill yourself. I think it's really beautiful what she did.
Okay, I really think that's an amazing adaptation of psychological healing to a really fucked up healthcare system. So I'm gonna say
Yes.
that. I
Okay.
do know her work, so I think that that's really incredible. I can't say that I have any clinical experience with borderline people. I only know them, anecdotally and through everyday life. So
Right.
I'm not sure that. I mean, classically speaking, like borderline in psychoanalysis means psychotic, but they
Yeah.
came up with these new terms for the DSMs to make them treatable and to make them visible to insurance companies and everything else.
Right.
And that's a whole other history, like a history of the DSM would be really interesting to go into.
Yeah.
That's not my purview here. But here's what I think like the psychoanalytic approach to healing would be. And I'm realizing now that it's like a whole lost art and technique, because they're not teaching this in the schools that you went to. And unless you go and do in psychoanalysis yourself, which is less and less accessible because
Right.
it's so
Yeah,
expensive
the
and everything
price.
else. It's just it's they screwed the pooch themselves, psychoanalysts, because they professionalized in the APA and then they jacked up their prices when they became a respectable profession in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and all the stars were going to get shrunk, and then they made themselves totally inaccessible to everyday
Well, and it's
people.
not billable. Insurance, like you said, I think that's another
Exactly.
structural element of it, that the insurance companies say, well, that's not evidence-based. And they're like, well, you can't measure this the same way. It works,
I'm
it
thinking,
flows
and
too
I don't.
much.
Yeah, absolutely. And these like institutes, these psychoanalytic institutes are super creepy too. Like they're
Yeah.
just, I was thinking like I just hang up my shingle, charge $20 an hour and just like listen to people and try to get a psychoanalytic group. But then there's like all this insurance and liability stuff. But anyway, so what psychoanalytically
hmm
leads to healing. And I think what you're describing, dialectical behavioral therapy, has elements of this too,
hmm
is that in the process, in the patient, in the analyst relationship, the patient discovers transference onto the analyst. The analyst has to
hmm
control the transference. Did you
hmm
learn about transference in school?
Oh, yeah, totally. Those concepts those are like foundational. Yeah.
So that comes from Freud. Like you can't
hmm
say that, you can't deny that. And then
hmm
in the transferential relationship and working through that transferential relationship, the analyst understands his or her relationship to fantasy, to the other, because the
hmm
analyst there stands in for both superego, for parent, for other, for lover, for all of these things. And then when you go into an analysis with anyone, with any therapist, there's an immediate transferential relationship, which you say, like, because if healing is going to take place, you have to believe that this person is capable of some magic, of some magical thing that you're
hmm
not capable of. And then, like, the healing process actually takes place when you undo that fantasy and you begin to see because this is what you almost fall in love with the analyst, because that's how the
hmm
transferential relationship is configured as. And the way that you fall in love with him or her is on the structure of the way you fall in love with other people, which could be very destructive and repetitive
hmm
and part of a repetition compulsion. And then through time, you work through what is your fantasy in this relationship, and that this fantasy comes from you. The hard part about the analyst position is you're responsible for the transference. You see the transference. You're not supposed to say like, hey, here's what's going on here. You have to hold the place and let this fantasy play out with minimum destruction to you and to the analysand. You have to remain, clear about the boundaries, but there is this like powerful intersubjective transactional thing that takes place when the analysand, discovers through free association his or her relationship to the unconscious, to the fantasy. And I think what you're describing here about once the patient enters the hospital system, the inventor of DBT says, I don't want to hear from you. That is actually drawing a transferential boundary.
Right.
And saying, I'm not going to participate in this savior model. Like, if you need to act out in this way, I'm actually going to restrict you, your access to me, because you're trying to evoke like the doctor medical establishment apparatus in your acting out. And then you're going to have to take those 48 hours or whatever and figure out what it is that you wanted, what your fantasy was in terms of this suicide attempt. And I think that that's very, very powerful, actually, because then you have to understand, like, what is my destruction about? What is my destructive impulse about? And then she returns, right, to the patient. And that's really important too. Like, you're drawing the boundary, but you also return. And one of the most, and so you make yourself a collaborator, the analyst, with the analysand with regard to the unconscious, which is in that room with you. And you help your patient feel like they can control their unconscious impulses because they have an ally in the room who's not a superhero or something like that, who doesn't have like all of these superhuman powers, which oftentimes neurotic and borderline patients project onto the other. And then you like understand what is actually going on. I don't know if that's mindfulness or I don't know what that is, but those kinds of insights that you reach in the process of understanding your transference to the analyst and understanding your unconscious, that is, the core of healing. And one of the things that it provides for you, the analysand, is a space of agency and also an understanding of your own involvement in repeating certain scenes in your life where you feel trapped by the unconscious. You're like, okay, I'm an agent of this. It's not like just shitty things happen to me. Like, I've repeated these things, and it's because I have this fantasy about, what the world is and what I am to the world. It takes time, right? This is not something that take place over 10 sessions. Everything is managed now. All care is restricted. And this is all part of neoliberal austerity politics that Freud would have had no idea of. Winnicott had no idea of. All the early psychoanalysts had no idea that managed care was going to be the dominant bureaucratic way in which psychological healing was going to take place. And I actually find it so degrading for both therapist and therapy when you have to fill out this dirt thing. I mean, I know it's the only way to get care. It's the only way to access being paid, or it's the only way to get your patient in the system. But it's degrading for everyone when you take away that question of the dialogic fantasy work through in the therapeutic moment, and you replace it with like an algorithm of stability or care. Because when I've done this too, when I've needed like spot on care, I filled out all of those forms, and it's like 1 to 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. How happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And it's like, why the F are you treating this like a customer satisfaction form, your own psychic life? How have we reified psychic life so much to parcel out little bits of care to people who are in distress? You have to enter the world of the algorithm. You have to enter the world of this kind of managerialism that is all about restricting people's access to care.
I'm going to see if I can convert this back to the PMC allyship question, which was that tongue-in-cheek sort of funny question, but tying these two together, because I think the managed careization of psychotherapy, I think also in some of these questions of like, how do I be a good ally to XYZ ABC group as a ABC XYZ identity concept, as I think you and I would agree is, I'll use the funny term problematic. It's a problematic framework. Maybe there's some helpfulness here and there. Good thing I don't have Twitter, but maybe somebody will cancel me for this. But the PMC ally concept that I was going to kind of throw out there, and I'll just, so let's say, PMC people are listening, and on that unconscious level, things are getting stirred up, and they're thinking, well, God, I'm a PMC. Oh no, shit, I'm a PMC. What do I do? Well, you can't talk to your damn therapist about that. Your therapist's a PMC too. So what are you going to goddamn do, right? So, okay, what do the PMCs do? So do PMCs, do we, the PMC, need to go to PMC allyship trainings as part of continued education credits? Do we need to get some diversity trainers, diversity, inclusivity, and equity workshops from D'Angelo and the rest of them to come into our nonprofits and our universities and our medical treatment centers, and to help us work through the implicit biases we have as PMCs, to then not microaggress against the blue collar workers, so that if we see the janitor in the hall, we don't look away in fear, and we don't give them a dirty look, and but we treat them with respect interpersonally. And so should we talk to our therapist about working through the internal kind of issues we have as PMCs, so that the working class can not be oppressed by us. Now, hopefully listeners know that I was being totally sarcastic when I was answering that question, because I'm obviously not serious.
So, like, the site of all the action is in the PMC psyche, in what you just described, in the story you just told. And that's like perfect class formation analysis. Like, it's all about them.
And it's like a managed care framework too, right?
You see yourself.
But it's like, how do we manage the implicit, interpersonal, and how do I find this script? Well, here's how I be the ally to the blue collar workers as the white collar worker.
It's all about your own it's all about PMC narcissism. It's not about systemic change or actually shutting the fuck up and doing your job correctly. It's all about affectual management.
I almost think that even using the transference, countertransference framework is, since you're removing the dirtiness of the relationship and the stuff that we need to work through, I think through class struggle processes, like through, say, union struggle, or you're going on a rent strike or whatever. I do a lot of tenant organizing these days, but I find that building the relationships with people of a pretty broad, diverse set of backgrounds, because that's, tenants, you got a pretty diverse swath of humans within the tenant category, right? That kind of working through the messiness of it and not following a script of okay, so this one's an immigrant from Mexico that doesn't speak. Okay, this one's a black woman, so I gotta brush up on my allyship memes or something, or the things to be how do I talk to this one without doing bad? That if I'm I'm a tenant, you're a tenant, and the landlords are trying to squeeze money out of us, and I'm going to offend people sometimes, and I'm going to there's going to be white guy stuff that happens from me, because that's how it works. And sometimes they're going to be I don't trust you. But I think this is why the word struggle, has been so present in the socialist vernacular for so long. But through the struggle, and maybe through the transference, countertransference, it's not a great analogy with that, I know, but that through the mistakes that we make interpersonally, maybe we start to kind of see each other as humans. And there are there's people feel hurt, or the way you said that, the way that you did talk over me, the white man did actually cut me off and talk over me, and or whatever, right? But through that struggle, maybe that there's relationships that are built through class struggle, as opposed to, okay, we need to kind of stop and see that we're separate, to the degree that we actually have to get more trainings on how to understand how separate we are, so that we can then maybe at a certain point we can manage our relationship from that sort of from the level of difference that is just not reconcilable. Right. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And it just it makes me sad. This whole conversation makes me sad, because it makes me realize there's a whole etiquette of engagement with the other that the PMC has invented to inhibit people from actually relating to each other as genuine human beings. And it's like an Emily Post thing, it's this class formation used to be about, dinner table manners, and the PMC has reduced politics and to a set of protocols. And it just makes me sad.
Yeah, makes me sad too.
But we have to fight against it, because most of the time I'm actually really angry. But Max, you've let me, get through the anger, work through the anger, get to the sadness, which I guess is supposed to be a healthy thing.
Yay! I'm a good therapist. I'm a good person. Rachel Maddow is going to have me on next, so we can soapbox against the. Now, what would happen? So, what about? Okay, here's a curveball question. What if we're just being like, if like Rachel Maddow or one of those people are like, yeah, my white privilege, man, and then all the like white liberals are watching MSNBC going like, yeah, that's right, my white privilege, and then they order the white fragility book. Are we doing that as PMC people? Or are we like, that's right, PMCs are garbage, and we're just like PMCs kind of like rejoicing in our awareness about ourselves or something?
No, because I actually say we need better professionals. We need better disinterested socialist professionalism. I'm not saying like you throw the baby out with bathwater. Like originally in the early part of the 19th century, when the PMC was a smaller class and actually really fighting on behalf of the working class against the robber barons, one of their greatest values was disinterestedness, which is the disinterested pursuit of truth without like the tyranny of the profit motive over our heads. And we need to find those values again. One of the things I say in the book is that what I really hate about post 68, professors and professional managerial class people is that they try to pretend that they're all avant-garde and transgressive. So, no, and I don't believe in self-flagellation, and I don't believe in self-regulation as the path to a better world. It's not about like trashing yourselves and being like, oh, my PMC privilege. No, get over yourselves. Have relationships with other people. Go out in the world, as you say, and organize, but also make clear in your mind, and as often as you can in other people's minds, the difference between an employee and a boss. We can't even tell that difference anymore.
Right. Well, and
So there's a lot of work to do, and self-flagellation is just not worth it. Okay.
Well, so man, this is fun. Thank you so much for coming on. This is a really interesting conversation, and anybody who has reactions of anger, rage, disgust, fear, hurt feelings. If anyone feels traumatized, if anyone feels, if any of my clients want to report me to the Board of Behavioral Sciences, you can just kind of Google them, and you can look up my license number. I'm not going to say it on air, and get my license taken away, so I'm no longer a PMC and I can just wash dishes in a restaurant somewhere. You can email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And if you want to support us by giving us your money, so we can kind of grow the PMC power over the working class, you can go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. But actually it pays 1/3 of the money goes to paying Liam for doing the editing and social media, which is cool because I got sick of doing it, and Harriet calls herself like a tech challenge person. So
yeah, and please buy my book so you can feel as angry as I do.
Oh yeah, it's really good, by the way. It's on my coffee table, which is, I was going to say that's a PM. That's a PMC thing to say is like not a funny joke anymore. It is a really good book. It's just called The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class.
Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class.
Yeah,
and feel free
Virtue
to
Hoarders.
email me as well. I do take DMs as well.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans but the top 10 or 20% of Americans have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and capitalism hits home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.